They were never supposed to come back alive. 3 men, floating, drifting, dying in silence. One wrong spark, one broken wire, and, suddenly, Earth was a distant memory, and death was everywhere. The year was 1970. NASA had already tasted the sweet victory of Apollo 11. The world had watched in awe as man walked on the moon. And then came Apollo 13, a mission that began with dreams and ended in sheer terror. From the outside, it looked like another calculated journey into space. But inside that spacecraft was pure chaos. Jim Lovell, Drake Swigert, they were the best of the best, astronauts trained to survive the impossible. But nothing could prepare them for the nightmare that would unfold more than 200,000 miles away from Earth. It started with a sound, just a soft bang. Then, lights flickered. Warning alarms screamed. Oxygen tanks were failing. Systems were shutting down. They were losing power and hope. What do you do when you're stuck in the vacuum of space? With freezing air biting your skin, carbon dioxide slowly choking you, and absolutely no one can reach you. For hours, the world had no idea. NASA scrambled to understand what had happened. The media stayed silent. Families feared the worst. And up there, in the vast nothingness of space, 3 men wrote goodbye letters to their loved ones, because they knew the odds were against them. But something happened that science still can't explain. A force of human will, a fight for life, a series of last-second decisions, born out of desperation and genius. What followed wasn't just a survival story. It became one of the most terrifying, emotional, and miraculous moments in human spaceflight history. This is not just a story about machines and missions. This is a story about 3 souls isolated in the darkest place imaginable, fighting to come home. So sit back, breathe in, and prepare yourself. Because this journey isn't just about space, it's about the terrifying silence between life and death. Before we take you deep into one of the most terrifying missions in human history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. If you're passionate about emotional space stories, hidden science, and unbelievable true events, then this is the place for you. Turn on notifications so you never miss the mysteries of our universe, because some stories are too powerful to forget. In April 1970, NASA launched what was supposed to be its 3rd mission to the moon, Apollo 13. The crew was ready. The world was watching. But just 56 hours into the flight, everything changed. An explosion crippled their spacecraft. Communications became unstable. Life support systems began to fail. And for a brief heart-stopping moment, the world thought it had lost 3 astronauts forever. But Apollo 13 was not the end. It became a symbol of hope, courage, and the fragile line between life and death in the vacuum of space. In this 2-hour documentary, we will take you deep into the mission. We'll relive the explosion, hear the astronauts' final words to Earth, witness the heartbreak inside NASA's mission control, and discover the near-impossible decisions that brought the crew home. Every second of this story is real. Every emotion is raw. And every breath the astronauts took could have been their last. The late 1960s was a time of great change. The world was caught between war and wonder, pain and possibility. But among all the struggles happening on Earth, something magical was taking place far above it. For the first time in human history, we were reaching for the stars, and actually touching them. The dream of leaving Earth, walking on the moon, and exploring the unknown was no longer just fantasy. It was real. In July 1969, everything changed. Millions of people across the world sat in front of their television screens, holding their breath, watching black and white images from a place no human had ever been before. That moment, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became part of human history forever. People cried, people clapped, people prayed. It was more than just science. It was hope. It was unity. It was proof that no dream was too big. Apollo 11 was not just a mission, it was a miracle. It showed us what was possible when human courage and technology worked together. The astronauts returned home as heroes, carrying not only moon rocks but the dreams of an entire planet. Newspapers called it the greatest achievement in history. Children looked up at the moon with wonder in their eyes, imagining their own footprints on its dusty surface. And NASA, once questioned and doubted, was now a symbol of limitless possibility. Just a few months later, Apollo 12 followed. It was quieter, smoother, and more technical. While the world's attention had somewhat faded, the mission proved that landing on the moon was not a fluke. We had done it again, this time with greater precision and confidence. The astronauts of Apollo 12 landed in the ocean of storms, collected samples, and performed experiments. They laughed, they worked, and once again, they returned home safely. The world had begun to believe that space was now within reach. By the time Apollo 13 was announced, space travel no longer felt terrifying. It felt routine. The media didn't pay as much attention. The public had grown used to hearing about astronauts and rocket launches. Even school children were beginning to think that trips to the moon might soon become normal. There was no fear, no suspense, no sense of danger. After all, NASA had already done it twice. What could go wrong now? The astronauts chosen for Apollo 13 were not beginners. They were skilled, respected, and prepared for anything. Jim Lovell, the mission commander, had already flown in space 3 times. He was calm, wise, and deeply trusted. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, was an experienced test pilot, chosen for his sharp mind and steady hands. And Jack Swigert, though added to the crew just days before the launch, was a professional, smart, trained, and ready. The goal of Apollo 13 was clear: land on the moon, collect data, and come home. The mission would take them to a new lunar region called the Framoro Highlands. Scientists believed this area held secrets about the moon's origin. It was an exciting opportunity for discovery, but it did not carry the emotional weight of the first moon landing. Still, the crew was proud. This was history in the making. Again, as the spacecraft stood tall on Launch Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, everything seemed perfect. Engineers checked every wire, every bolt, every command system. Families waved, flags flew, the countdown began, and when the engines roared to life, there was no fear, only pride. Apollo 13 lifted off the ground, cutting through the blue Florida sky like a silver arrow aimed at destiny. The first hours of the mission went smoothly. The astronauts smiled, they joked. They filmed videos for school children back on Earth. The mood inside the spacecraft was light. They were focused, but relaxed. It was just another trip to the moon, or so they thought. Back at Mission Control in Houston, the atmosphere was also calm. Teams of engineers monitored data, ran simulations, and made small adjustments. The room was full of intelligence and experience. These were the men and women who had guided Neil Armstrong to the surface of the moon. They believed in the mission. They trusted the spacecraft. And they knew that this team, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert, was among the best they had ever sent. No one could see what was coming. No one could feel the silent danger that was hiding inside one of the spacecraft's oxygen tanks. It was invisible, unpredictable, waiting. But for now, all was well. The crew continued their journey into space, unaware that they were flying toward the edge of disaster. Families back home were calm. Wives smiled at their children, showing them pictures of the astronauts floating in zero gravity. News stations gave short updates, but nothing urgent. To the world, Apollo 13 was just another success. Another chapter in the book of human achievement. But space is not a place of comfort. It is cold, it is silent, it does not forgive mistakes, and it does not care about human dreams. What no one knew was that the wires inside the oxygen tank, the very system responsible for keeping the astronauts alive, were damaged. A small oversight, a technical error, a detail lost in the long line of preparations. It was a tiny flaw, but it would become a deadly one. And soon, Apollo 13 would go from being a quiet mission to becoming a global emergency. The world would stop, NASA would scramble, and 3 men would come face to face with the terrifying possibility that they might never see Earth again. But that is where the true story begins. Not in the glory, not in the success, but in the silence that follows the explosion. In the breath that catches when hope begins to die. And yet, in that darkest hour, something greater would rise. Not from machines, not from computers, but from the hearts of the people who refused to give up. People on Earth, and 3 souls, drifting through space, holding on to life with everything they had. This was not Apollo 11, this was not a victory parade, this was Apollo 13, and it would become one of the most terrifying, emotional, and unforgettable missions in all of human history. In every great story of survival, there are faces behind the struggle, people whose courage and pain shaped the outcome. Apollo 13 wasn't just a spacecraft caught in a crisis. It was a fragile home to 3 human beings. Each man carried his own dreams, fears, and reasons for being there. Each of them had a family waiting at home, and each of them, in that cold and quiet place above Earth, would be tested like never before. Jim Lovell was the commander of Apollo 13. He was no stranger to space. In fact, he was one of NASA's most experienced astronauts. Before Apollo 13, he had already flown in space 3 times. He had orbited the moon on Apollo 8, the first humans to ever travel that far. He had looked out of the window at the vast gray surface, and had seen Earth rise like a blue jewel in the darkness. He had come close to walking on the moon once before. And now, at age 42, this was finally his chance to do it. But Jim was not chasing fame. He had already tasted it. He didn't need medals or headlines. What drove him was something deeper: his love for space, his belief in exploration, and his sense of duty. He was calm under pressure, thoughtful in his decisions, and deeply respected by everyone who worked with him. People trusted Jim. They knew that if anything ever went wrong, he was the man you would want leading the way. He had the heart of a father, the brain of an engineer, and the spirit of a soldier. At home, Jim was a family man. He had a wife, Marilyn, and 4 children. They had watched him leave for space before. They had hugged him goodbye, prayed for his safety, and waited for his voice to echo through the radios. His wife had become strong through those years, learning how to live with the silence, the distance, and the danger. But this time felt different. It was supposed to be his final flight. One last mission before retirement. One last dream to fulfill. Walking on the moon. Beside Jim was Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot. Fred was quieter, less known to the public, but inside NASA, his name carried great weight. He was a skilled test pilot with sharp instincts and a deep understanding of the spacecraft. He had trained for years for this very moment. Apollo 13 was to be his first flight into space and he had earned it. Fred came from humble beginnings. He was not born into privilege. He worked hard for every opportunity, every flight hour, every step that brought him to NASA. He believed in preparation, in discipline, in always being ready for the unexpected. His dream wasn't just to go to the moon, it was to prove to himself and to the world that he belonged there, that he could do it. There was a quiet fire inside Fred. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was the kind of man who studied every manual, every wire, every line of code inside the spacecraft. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He respected the risk. He knew what space could do to a man, and he was ready. Fred had a wife and children too. He had kissed them goodbye, smiled for the cameras, and boarded the rocket like a soldier heading to battle. But deep inside, he carried a boyhood dream, one born under southern skies, watching the stars, imagining the impossible. Then came Jack Swigert, third man aboard Apollo 13. His journey to this mission was different from the others. Jack was not originally part of the main crew. Just days before the launch, the original command module pilot, Ken Mattingly, was pulled from the flight due to medical concerns. NASA feared he might come down with measles during the mission, and with only days to go, a replacement was needed. That replacement was Jack Swigert. Jack was ready. He had trained for this kind of emergency his whole life. He was a pilot, an engineer, and a thinker. But stepping into someone else's role just days before launch was no easy task. He had to absorb complex procedures, build chemistry with the crew, and adjust to a spacecraft that wasn't prepared for him. It was like jumping onto a speeding train and trying to steer it. Many people doubted him, not because he lacked skills, but because time was short, and space does not forgive errors. But Jack was determined. He had worked too long and waited too hard to waste this chance. He stepped up, quietly and confidently, knowing that this might be his only opportunity to fly. Jack had a charm about him. He was handsome, intelligent, and had a certain confidence that made people feel safe. He believed in logic, in systems, in solving problems with his mind, but underneath the confident exterior, he was deeply aware of the weight he now carried. He was joining two seasoned astronauts, and the world would be watching. Despite their different paths, the three men quickly built a bond. In the days leading up to the launch, they trained together, rehearsed emergencies, and shared stories. There was laughter, there was respect, and above all, there was trust. They were three individuals, but inside that spacecraft, they had to become one. One voice, one brain, one heartbeat. Because in space, there is no room for ego. There is only survival. On the day of the launch, they walked together, side by side, wearing their white suits, helmets in hand. Cameras flashed, crowds cheered. Their families watched from a distance, hiding their fear behind brave smiles. The crew looked calm, but each man knew what was at stake. As they entered the spacecraft, sat in their seats, and began the final countdown, they were more than astronauts. They were explorers. They were pioneers. They were willing to risk everything not for glory, but for the pursuit of something greater. When the rocket roared into the sky, their lives changed forever. For a moment, all fear vanished. They were weightless, surrounded by stars, chasing a dream older than time. They were no longer just men. They were symbols of what humanity could achieve. But dreams can turn into nightmares without warning. And soon, these three men would face a test that no training could prepare them for. A silent explosion, a broken ship, a fight for breath, for heat, for life. They would not walk on the moon, but they would walk through something far more powerful. They would walk through fear. They would walk through death's shadow. And they would walk into history not as astronauts who landed, but as men who endured. Their names Lovell Hays and Swigert would become forever linked with one word: survival. The sun rose slowly over Florida's coast on the morning of April 11, 1970. The skies were mostly clear, with a soft breeze brushing across the ocean. There was something sacred about that morning, as if the Earth itself was holding its breath. At Kennedy Space Center, a massive structure stood tall against the sky, the Saturn V rocket, shining white and silver, waiting to be awakened. Hours before launch, the three astronauts were already awake. They had eaten their traditional breakfast of steak and eggs, dressed in their spacesuits, and smiled for the cameras one last time. There were no tears, no trembling voices, just calm, focus, steady hands, and eyes filled with purpose. Inside their hearts, each of them carried something different. Jim Lovell carried the responsibility of leadership. He was not just thinking about the mission, he was thinking about the safety of his crew. Fred Hays carried silent excitement. This was his first spaceflight, and soon he would be traveling farther than most humans had ever gone. Jack Swigert, though new to the team, carried the pressure of proving himself worthy. He had been called in at the last minute, and now, he was about to launch into history. At 11 a.m., final checks began. Engineers ran through endless lists of systems, pressures, and procedures. The countdown echoed across the base, and technicians watched every screen, every signal, every blinking light. The rocket itself, taller than a 36-story building, stood quiet, still, like a sleeping giant ready to rise. Crowds had gathered miles away to watch. Families, students, reporters, and tourists stood behind fences, binoculars in hand. Among them were the wives and children of the astronauts, hiding their fears behind hopeful smiles. They had done this before, but it never got easier. Watching the person you love sit on a fireball of fuel and steel never becomes normal. The countdown reached its final moments. -10, 9, 8. Inside the capsule, the astronauts sat shoulder to shoulder, strapped tightly into their seats. Their helmets were sealed, their suits pressurized. The cockpit lights blinked softly, like stars inside a machine. 7, 6, 5. The engines ignited with a thunder that shook the ground. Flames burst from the base of the rocket, lighting up the sky like sunrise. 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. With a deep, deafening roar, the Saturn V began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster, piercing through the air with fire and smoke trailing behind. Inside the capsule, the force pressed down on their chests. Every vibration rattled their bones. Their bodies were crushed into their seats as the rocket climbed, but there was no fear in their voices. Only control, calculation, and calm. They called out data, confirmed engine burns, and monitored instruments. This was what they had trained for. As the rocket broke through the clouds, the ground below disappeared into mist. Earth became smaller and smaller, a blue curve on the horizon. The noise faded, the shaking stopped, and then, silence. They were weightless. Floating inside the command module, they unstrapped their harnesses and looked out the small round windows. Below them was Earth, so distant, so beautiful, spinning slowly in black space. It was a view that made even the strongest men feel small. And yet, at that moment, they felt part of something eternal. The mission had officially begun. Apollo 13 was on its way to the moon. Over the next few hours, everything went according to plan. The spacecraft separated from the rocket's third stage. The command module, called Odyssey, was now joined with the lunar module, Aquarius. Both ships were connected, floating together like a pair of puzzle pieces in space. The systems worked. The engines worked. The crew worked. It all felt smooth. Back on Earth, Mission Control in Houston tracked every move. Engineers sat at their consoles, listening to the astronauts' voices, watching data flow across the screens. They were focused, but not tense. After all, Apollo 11 and 12 had already proven that these missions could succeed. For the people in the control room, Apollo 13 was simply step 3 in a long line of progress. The astronauts moved about inside the spacecraft, getting used to zero gravity. Jack Swigert made a lighthearted radio broadcast, reminding everyone on Earth to file their taxes, a joke that made the control room laugh. Fred Hayes filmed video of the spacecraft interior, floating with his camera, giving people on Earth a tour of their new home in space. Jim Lovell kept his attention on the flight path, navigation, and system checks. He knew better than to ever let his guard down. But still, the mood was light. There was no reason to worry. Each of the astronauts took turns resting, eating, and running through drills. They had practiced emergency scenarios hundreds of times in simulators. Fire, pressure, loss, power, failure. They knew the checklists by heart, but deep down none of them expected to use those skills. Not really. Outside their windows, the stars didn't twinkle. They burned steady and cold. The sun was a distant light, and the moon was growing closer. Every hour brought them deeper into the dark. But inside the ship, the lights were warm, the voices friendly, the air safe to breathe. Space felt less like a void and more like a tunnel they were traveling through. With a clear destination at the end, for the people watching on Earth, it all looked perfect. Television anchors reported that the mission was progressing smoothly. NASA released images of the astronauts floating, smiling, working. There was no sense of danger, no hint of what would come next. Families of the astronauts watched proudly. Children drew pictures of rockets. Schools held lessons about the moon. The world had grown used to success and forgot that space never guarantees anything. 2 days passed like that. Quiet, peaceful, normal. The crew made a live television broadcast showing life aboard the spacecraft. They floated in and out of view, laughing and explaining how they ate, drank, and moved in zero gravity. It was meant to inspire the public, but many TV stations didn't even air it. The ratings were low. People had stopped being amazed by space. But the men inside the ship were still in awe. Jim Lovell stared out the window for long moments, his face still thoughtful. He had been here before. He had orbited the moon once, but never landed. This time, he was supposed to walk on it. He imagined what it would feel like to place his feet on that gray surface, to leave footprints where no one had stepped, to speak words that the world would remember. It was his dream, and it was just days away. Fred Hayes was preparing for that dream too. He rehearsed the lunar procedures, studied maps of the landing site, and mentally walked through every movement. He had waited years for this moment. It wasn't just about being the first. It was about doing it right. Jack Swigert, though not going down to the surface, played just as important a role. He would stay in orbit, keeping the systems running, ensuring the ship was ready to bring them all home. His job required precision, timing, and total focus. And he was ready. Everything was ready. Or so it seemed, because somewhere inside that perfect ship, hidden behind metal and wires, something had already started to go wrong. A silent flaw, a weakness no one had seen, a fuse that was waiting to blow. But on April 11th, during launch and the hours that followed, no one knew. The rocket had risen. The astronauts were safe. The systems were working. It was the calm before the storm, the breath before the scream, the moment before history changed forever. It was just after 9 in the evening, 2 days after launch. The spacecraft was over 200,000 miles away from Earth, cruising smoothly toward the moon. Inside, everything felt calm. The astronauts had just finished a live television broadcast, showing people on Earth how they were living in space. They floated in front of the camera, smiling, laughing, and explaining how they worked and slept in zero gravity. The world wasn't watching closely, but the crew didn't mind. They were still proud, still focused, still in control. After the broadcast, they turned off the cameras and got back to their tasks. Jack Swigert was told to stir the oxygen tanks, a routine job they had done many times before. It was simple. Just flip a switch to mix the contents of the tanks, keeping the oxygen from settling unevenly. No one thought anything of it. Jack reached out and flipped the switch. And then, in less than a second, everything changed. There was a sudden bang, loud, deep, and violent. The kind of sound that doesn't just fill your ears, but shakes your bones. It wasn't a small bump or a gentle vibration. It was an explosion. A real one. The entire spacecraft shook. Lights flickered. Warning. Alarms screamed. The temperature dropped almost immediately. It was chaos. Fast, sharp, and terrifying. Fred Hayes shouted, "What the hell was that?" Jack Swigert's hands flew over the controls, checking for failure. Jim Lovell's heart pounded. Years of training kicked in. They looked at each other, floating in weightlessness, but surrounded by danger. This was no simulation. This was real. Within seconds, the control panel began lighting up like a Christmas tree. Red, yellow, blinking symbols of failure. Systems were shutting down. Gauges were dropping. They didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but it was serious. Very serious. Lovell grabbed the radio. He called out calmly, trying to steady his voice. "Houston, we've had a problem." On the ground, inside NASA's mission control in Houston, the words hit like a punch to the chest. Engineers froze. Heads turned. The line crackled with tension. One moment everything was fine, and now, everything was falling apart. Flight controllers scrambled. They looked at their monitors and saw the same thing the crew did. Oxygen levels dropping. Electrical power failing. Fuel cells shutting down. One by one, systems were going dark. This wasn't a glitch. This was a life-threatening failure. At first, no one understood. How could a routine oxygen stir lead to an explosion? The engineers replayed data, ran numbers, checked diagrams, and then came the horrible truth. Oxygen tank No. 2 had exploded. It had ripped open the side of the service module. Debris had been blown into space. The remaining tank was leaking fast. Without oxygen, the fuel cells which powered the spacecraft could not generate electricity. No electricity meant no lights, no computers, no heat, no water. In space, everything depends on everything else. And now, almost everything was failing. The astronauts were in serious danger. Inside the ship, the air grew colder, the lights dimmed, the sound of fans slowed down. Carbon dioxide began to build up. Every breath they took was a race against time. They had limited power, limited water, limited air, and no room for mistakes. Fred Hayes moved quickly, checking the life support systems. Jack Swigert focused on trying to reroute power to keep the communications alive. Lovell tried to stay calm. He had one job now, keep his crew focused and get them home alive. But even he could feel the fear crawling into the room. The spacecraft was still on course to the moon, but they could no longer land. That dream was over. Now the only mission was survival. The moon would have to wait. The new goal was Earth. But how? The main spacecraft, the command module Odyssey, was dying. It couldn't support them for the journey home. It had lost most of its power and oxygen. If they stayed in it, they would suffocate or freeze before ever seeing Earth again. There was only one hope. The lunar module, Aquarius. Originally meant to carry 2 men down to the moon's surface, it was now their lifeboat. It had oxygen, batteries, and basic life support. But it was never designed to keep 3 people alive for 4 days. It would be tight, cold, dangerous. But it was their only chance. One by one, the astronauts shut down the command module. They turned off lights, systems, and heaters. The capsule, once warm and full of energy, fell silent and cold. Then they moved into the lunar module, bringing only what they needed. There was no time for emotion, no time for fear, only action. But inside, each man was thinking the same thing. We might not make it. Mission control back on Earth was fully awake now. Every screen glowing, every mind racing. They had to help the crew survive. Without the systems they had always depended on. Engineers worked through the night, running simulations, building emergency plans, thinking outside of every rule book. They couldn't fix the damage, but maybe, just maybe, they could guide the astronauts home. The problem was bigger than anyone imagined. Not only had they lost oxygen, but carbon dioxide. The gas we exhale was building up inside the lunar module. If it reached a certain level, it would poison them. They needed to clean the air. But the lunar module's filters weren't enough for 3 people. The command module had the right filters, but they were square. The ones in the lunar module were round. They didn't fit. It became the most urgent puzzle in space history. How do you fit a square peg into a round hole? NASA's engineers, using only items the astronauts had aboard, duct tape, plastic bags, cardboard, built a filter system. Then they radioed the steps, one by one, to the crew. The astronauts followed carefully, building it like a child building a toy, with their lives on the line. It worked. The air was clean again, for now. But outside the spacecraft, the cold darkness of space surrounded them. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze. The walls of the module iced over. The men shivered in their suits, teeth chattering, fingers numb. They had to conserve power. No heaters, minimal lights, almost no food. Every hour was a test of endurance, and every second, they drifted farther from home. For a moment, Earth wasn't even visible. Only stars, silence, and fear. They looked at each other, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Fred Hayes began feeling sick. Fever, pain, dehydration. But he didn't complain. He kept working. Jack Swigert stayed sharp, solving technical problems, checking and rechecking systems. Jim Lovell watched over them both. He knew they were on the edge of survival. But giving up was not an option. They began to write letters to their families. Quiet messages, just in case they never made it home. But deep inside, they held on to one fragile hope. That the people back on Earth would find a way. That somehow, through all the damage, there was still a path home. This was no longer just a technical failure. This was a battle between human will and the cold laws of space. The explosion had stolen their dream. Now, they would fight for their lives. And the whole world was about to watch. After the explosion, everything changed inside the spacecraft. The once secure and stable environment turned into a fragile shelter floating in the blackness of space. The command module, their main ship, was now almost useless. Its power was gone. The systems were shutting down. The lights had faded. The heat was disappearing. What was once a working space vehicle was now turning into a lifeless capsule, like a coffin adrift in the stars. The crew had no choice but to move into the lunar module. Aquarius was never meant to be a home. It was designed only to take 2 astronauts to the moon for a short time. It wasn't built for long journeys or to hold 3 men, but now, it had to keep them alive for several days. That small, cramped space became their last hope. The first thing they noticed was the cold. As power was shut off to preserve energy, the warmth quickly faded. The walls became cold to the touch. Their breath turned into fog. Water droplets floated in the air and began to freeze. The temperature kept dropping. It fell to levels far below what their bodies were prepared for. The men wore their spacesuits, layered with clothes, but nothing seemed to help. Their hands went numb. Their toes lost feeling. They shivered constantly, not from fear this time, but from the cold that pierced through everything. Even the simplest tasks became hard. Holding a pen was painful. Pushing buttons took great effort. Their fingers were stiff, their joints ached. The floor, walls, and equipment were covered in frost. Their only source of heat was each other's body warmth, and even that wasn't enough. Every hour they grew weaker, the bitter freeze stealing their strength slowly and silently. But it wasn't just the cold that hurt them. There was almost no food left. The water supply had to be rationed. They had small packets of space food, but it wasn't enough. Dehydrated meals couldn't be prepared without hot water, and they didn't have any heat, so they ate cold, dry bites. Just enough to stay awake. The water they drank was cold, metallic, and limited to only sips. They were constantly hungry. Their mouths were dry, their bodies were tired. Yet they had to keep working. And through all of this, there was no escape from the darkness. Outside, space was pitch black. The sun was no comfort. Only a blinding light on one side of the spacecraft, and complete darkness on the other. Inside the module, with lights dimmed to conserve power, shadows filled every corner. The hum of machines was gone. It was silent, too silent. Just the sound of breathing, the ticking of instruments, and the whispers between crewmates. But even worse than the cold, hunger, and silence, was the fear. They didn't know if they would make it back to Earth. Every moment brought new questions. What if the air runs out? What if the CO filter fails? What if the guidance system stops working? What if the spacecraft breaks apart during re-entry? No one had answers. There was no book for this situation. They were alone in deep space, over 200,000 miles from home, and nothing was guaranteed. The psychological toll was crushing. Jim Lovell, the commander, tried to stay strong. He had been to space before. He had trained for years, but nothing could have prepared him for this. Every time he looked at his crew, he saw the weight of the mission in their eyes. He couldn't show weakness. He had to guide them. Stay focused, stay calm. But even inside him, doubt was growing like a shadow. Fred Hayes was getting sicker. At first, it was just chills, then fever, then pain. He began to suffer from a urinary tract infection. There was no doctor, no medicine, only suffering and silence. But Fred didn't complain. He worked through it. He smiled when he needed to. He didn't want to become a burden, but his body was breaking down. Jack Swigert, the newest crew member, felt the pressure more than anyone. He had joined the mission just days before launch, replacing a sick colleague. Some had doubted his readiness. Now, in the face of disaster, he was proving his worth. Solving technical issues, managing power systems, supporting the others. But inside he carried the guilt. Was it something I did? Was it my fault? He knew it wasn't, but the mind plays tricks when fear takes over. They all battled the same silent enemy, hopelessness. There were moments when the crew sat quietly, too tired to speak. Time moved slowly. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. The same thoughts haunted them. Will we ever see our families again? Will our bodies drift forever in space? Will we die alone? They thought about their children, about their wives, about the lives waiting for them back on Earth. The birthdays they might miss, the hugs they may never feel again, the letters left unwritten, the words left unsaid. These thoughts didn't just bring tears to their eyes. They pierced through their hearts like knives, but they kept going. NASA engineers on Earth worked tirelessly, sending instructions, solutions, and hope. Every time the radio came alive with a voice from Mission Control, it was like a lifeline being thrown across the void. Those voices kept them connected, kept them grounded, kept them sane. Every message meant someone still believed they could make it. The astronauts wrote down everything, every instruction, every calculation, every checklist. Even in the cold, even in exhaustion, they followed the steps. They didn't want to make a single mistake, because one wrong move and it could all be over. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. They closed their eyes for short naps, but the fear wouldn't let them rest. Even when sleep came, it wasn't peaceful. It was disturbed by cold, pain, and nightmares. The body tried to recover, but the mind never stopped. They drifted through space in a metal box, surrounded by nothingness, moving toward a distant Earth that seemed more like a dream than a destination. The silence made them feel small, fragile, forgotten, yet still, they held on. They found strength in each other. When one began to break, the others lifted him up. When Fred felt weak, Jim encouraged him. When Jack felt pressure, Fred reassured him. When Jim doubted, the others looked to him with trust. They were not just astronauts. They were brothers now, bound by fear, hope, and survival. They reminded each other of the goal. We are going home. Day by day, mile by mile, they endured. They laughed sometimes, even in the worst moments. They joked about the cold, about the food, about who smelled the worst. It wasn't much, but it helped. It reminded them they were still human, still alive. And back on Earth, the world was beginning to watch. What had been a quiet mission had turned into a global story. People from every country were praying. News anchors gave updates every hour. Children wrote letters. Families held their breath. It wasn't just three men fighting for survival anymore. It was all of humanity hoping they would return. Inside the spacecraft, the men didn't feel like heroes. They felt scared, exhausted, frozen, but they never gave up. And that, more than anything else, would keep them alive. While three men floated in a crippled spacecraft more than 200,000 miles from home, a second, silent battle was being fought far below on Earth. Not in space, but in a fluorescent-lit room in Houston, Texas. NASA's Mission Control. It didn't look like much to outsiders. Just rows of desks, monitors, switchboards, and men in white shirts and black ties. But in that room, history was unfolding. Lives were hanging in the balance. Time was their enemy. And failure was not an option. As soon as the words crackled through the radio, "Houston, we've had a problem," everything changed. The room didn't erupt in chaos. It fell into a heavy silence. For a few seconds, the engineers and controllers froze. Their hands hovered over switches. Their eyes stared at the glowing screens. No one wanted to believe it, but they all knew. Something had gone terribly wrong. Something big, something they hadn't trained for, something that could kill those men in space. Gene Kranz, the flight director, stood at the center of it all. Calm on the outside, but burning on the inside. He knew this wasn't just a technical issue. This was a life-or-death situation. His voice broke the silence. "Okay, let's work the problem, people. Let's not make things worse by guessing." And with that, the quiet room transformed into a machine. Dozens of people working as one. The challenge before them was unthinkable. The command module had lost power. Life support was failing. The crew had moved into the lunar module, but it wasn't designed for long-term survival. Every system, every solution, had to be rewritten, reimagined, rebuilt from scratch. Not in weeks or days, but in hours. They had to design life-saving procedures using slide rules, pencils, and phones. There was no Google, no simulation powerful enough to model this disaster. It was human minds versus the impossible. In room after room across NASA, engineers grabbed paper, manuals, calculators. Some slept on the floor, some didn't sleep at all. They worked in shifts, then refused to go home. They skipped meals, they missed birthdays, they didn't care about awards or praise. They just wanted one thing: bring the crew home alive. They asked themselves hard questions. How can we keep the astronauts breathing when carbon dioxide is rising? How do we fit a square air filter into a round hole with nothing but tape? plastic bags, and cardboard. How can we shut down systems without freezing the men to death? How can we save power for re-entry without losing control of the ship? Every answer they gave brought new questions. Every idea was a thread, and they were trying to weave a lifeline in the dark. But technical problems weren't the only burden. Outside the building, families of the astronauts waited. In silence, in fear, in prayer. Marilyn Lovell, Jim's wife, stayed near Mission Control, but avoided the press. She refused to cry on camera. She refused to let her children see her break. She smiled when she had to. She told them, "Daddy's going to be okay," even when she didn't believe it herself. Inside, her heart was breaking with every news update, every whisper from NASA officials, every glance at the sky. Fred Hayes' wife, Mary, watched from home, clutching the phone. She had barely slept. The kids asked questions she couldn't answer. Jack Swiggert's family was glued to the television, watching every update with fear that this might be the last they'd hear of him. They weren't just watching a mission, they were watching their sons, their husbands, their fathers fight for life in real time. Back in Mission Control, tension built with every hour. The room stayed dimly lit, coffee cups stacked up, ashtrays overflowed, eyes burned from lack of sleep. Voices were hoarse from constant updates and calls. The weight of the situation pressed down on every man in the room, but none of them left their posts. None of them gave up. At one point, an engineer broke down crying in the hallway. Another punched a wall in frustration. These weren't emotionless machines. They were humans carrying the unbearable pressure of 3 lives. But each time they faltered, someone pulled them back in. Someone reminded them, "We are their only hope." When the CO levels began to rise dangerously, panic gripped the room. If they couldn't find a way to filter it, the crew would suffocate. Not because of a lack of oxygen, but because of their own breath. Engineers scrambled to solve the problem. And then came one of the most famous solutions in space history, the mailbox. A square filter needed to fit a round hole, using only the materials on board: duct tape, cardboard, a sock. On Earth, a team built a prototype and gave step-by-step instructions. In space, the astronauts followed them exactly. And it worked. Against all odds, it worked. Each success brought only a small sigh of relief, because there were still too many dangers ahead. The spacecraft's trajectory had to be corrected. Manually, that meant the astronauts had to fire the engine using only a stopwatch, a pencil, and the view of Earth in the window. Any mistake, and they'd skip off Earth's atmosphere and be lost forever. Mission Control held its breath. And when the maneuver worked, cheers broke out. Quiet cheers, quickly replaced by new calculations. In the background, the world watched. News anchors spoke with somber tones. Millions prayed. Schools held moments of silence. Churches stayed open all night. This was no longer just a NASA crisis. It was a global moment of unity, all for 3 souls lost in the void, and through it all, Gene Kranz stood firm. His vest white and crisp, his face lined with worry, his mind laser-focused. He told his team, "This will be our finest hour." And it was. Every second mattered. Every voice counted. Every solution was a thread in the rope, pulling those men back to Earth. Even when the systems seemed to fail. Even when backup plans failed, even when the odds said the crew would never return, they kept fighting, because to them, giving up was not an option. They had been entrusted with lives, and they would not let them slip away into the darkness of space. Families waited, children held on to hope. Engineers worked until they collapsed. Flight directors made decisions with shaking hands. And still, they moved forward. They weren't in the spotlight. They weren't floating in space. But their battle on the ground was just as heroic. It was quiet, unseen. But without it, Apollo 13 would have become a tragedy, not a triumph. And as the spacecraft began its long path back toward Earth, Mission Control prepared for the most dangerous part of all. Re-entry. A few minutes would decide the fate of the mission, and they knew. If the angle was wrong, if the heat shield failed, if the parachutes didn't open, all would be lost. Still, they believed. They believed in math, in teamwork, in each other. In those moments, they weren't just saving a mission. They were proving something greater, that human beings, when pushed to the edge, can still choose courage over fear, reason over panic, unity over despair. And somewhere out there in the silence of space, 3 men were holding on, hoping that the voices they heard through their radio, tired, stressed, but determined, would guide them home. The cold, the silence, and the dark of space were already unbearable, but something far more invisible and far more dangerous was quietly filling the lunar module. Carbon dioxide. It was a silent killer, rising with every breath the astronauts took. They had escaped one disaster after the explosion, but now, another was building up in the background. A chemical enemy that did not need flames or noise. Just time, and it was running out. The crew was alive inside the tiny lunar module, designed for 2 men for 2 days, now stretched to keep 3 men alive for 4 days. Already, their bodies were struggling. They were cold, dehydrated, exhausted, but what none of them could see, and only the instruments could measure, was that the air they were breathing was slowly becoming toxic. Not because of a lack of oxygen, but because their carbon dioxide scrubbers were failing. The lithium hydroxide canisters in the command module had worked fine, But after the explosion, that module had to be shut down. They had moved to the lunar module, and now the filters inside it were not enough. The levels of CO were rising dangerously. Inside mission control, a sharp beep sounded from one of the consoles. A red number blinked on the screen. The life support engineers leaned in, checking, hoping it was a glitch. It wasn't. The astronauts were slowly being poisoned by their own breath. Every exhale added to the weight of danger. They were suffocating, even as they floated in a room full of air. But this wasn't just a technical failure. It was a puzzle, a cruel riddle, because there were plenty of spare CO filters back in the command module. But those filters were square. The ones in the lunar module were round. They were incompatible. The phrase would soon become famous. We've got to make a square peg fit into a round hole. It sounded impossible. It looked ridiculous. But if they couldn't, do it. If they couldn't, make the square canisters from the command module somehow work inside the lunar module, then the crew would slowly lose consciousness and die in their sleep. It wouldn't be quick. It would be slow and terrible. Headaches, dizziness, confusion, a fog of gas they couldn't see or stop. That was the future if mission control failed. Gene Kranz looked across the room. We need a miracle, he said. But even miracles have to be built. A team of engineers, chemists, and life support experts were quickly pulled together and thrown into a side room at NASA. Their mission was clear. Build an adapter using only the items the astronauts had on board. They couldn't just design anything. It had to be practical. It had to be buildable in space. By tired, freezing astronauts, without tools. It had to be safe, and it had to work fast. On a long conference table, they laid out every item the astronauts had with them. A plastic bag, some cardboard, duct tape, a piece of their flight plan, hose from the spacesuits, even a sock. It looked more like junk than supplies. But these scraps were their only hope. Around the table, some of the best minds in America leaned in. No one laughed. No one said it was crazy. They simply got to work. They tried different versions, sketched designs, taped things together with shaking hands. Every part was tested, checked, rechecked. They used trial and error, testing pressure and flow, watching for leaks. They measured the time the astronauts had left, and they kept going. No one stopped to eat. No one stepped outside. Time was the enemy, and the room felt like a bomb counting down. Finally, they had something that looked like it might work. A makeshift contraption with a square lithium hydroxide canister attached to a plastic bag, sealed with tape, connected to a tube that fit the lunar module's ventilation. It looked awkward, ugly, desperate, but it was beautiful to them. It just might save 3 lives. Now came the hardest part, sending the instructions to the astronauts in space. There were no videos, no diagrams. They had to describe everything, every piece, every step. Over radio, they had to turn engineers into teachers and astronauts into mechanics. They read slowly, step by step, telling the crew which bag to use, which page to tear, how many inches of tape to measure. And the astronauts, working with numb fingers and barely enough light, followed every step carefully. Their hands shook. Their minds were foggy from the rising CO, but they kept going. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert didn't complain. They didn't panic. They listened and worked like surgeons, building a lifeline with scraps. When the device was finally sealed and turned on, they waited. The engineers on Earth waited too, holding their breath, watching the CO meters. Then, the numbers stopped rising, and slowly they began to fall. It worked. A wave of relief swept through mission control. Some engineers clapped softly, others wept silently. Lives had been saved by tape, plastic, and genius. No computer could have done it. No machine could have invented it. It was human ingenuity, raw and stubborn, that had pulled the astronauts back from the brink. But even then, the moment didn't last long. The engineers wiped their faces, took a breath, and went back to work, because there were still more problems to solve. They still had to bring the crew home. But the mailbox, as it came to be called, was a turning point. It reminded everyone, including the astronauts, that they were not alone, that somewhere on Earth, people were fighting just as hard for them as they were fighting to stay alive. Inside the spacecraft, the air began to feel lighter. The headaches faded. Their thinking became clearer. For the first time since the explosion, hope returned to the lunar module. The crew didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just closed their eyes for a moment and breathed. In the public eye, the world didn't see the behind-the-scenes miracle. They saw calm faces and short updates. But behind those cool reports were nights without sleep, minds on the edge, and hearts filled with fear. The miracle of Apollo 13 wasn't just in surviving an explosion. It was in solving the unsolvable, in turning a death trap into a lifeboat. Later, the lithium canister fix would be studied in classrooms, taught in engineering schools, remembered in documentaries. But at that moment, it wasn't about legacy. It was about life. About a group of people who refused to let 3 men die, even when the solution looked like junk held together with tape. This was not the work of luck. It was the work of people who believed that with enough heart, enough brains, and enough stubbornness, even the impossible could be done. The fix didn't look like a miracle. It looked like desperation, but that's what made it real. That's what made it unforgettable. And it worked. not because it was perfect, but because it had to. It was never just about going to space. For Jim Lovell and his crew, the moon was the dream, the shining goal at the edge of human achievement. They had trained, suffered, sacrificed, and carried the hopes of a nation in their hearts. For Lovell, this would have been his fourth flight, but his first chance to walk on the lunar surface. For Fred Hayes, it was supposed to be the moment he stepped into history, his first mission, his first moon, and even for Jack Swigert, who had joined at the last moment, it was a chance to stand where only a few had ever stood, to leave a footprint on another world. The moon was not just a destination. It was a promise, a reward, a symbol of everything they believed in. But now, through the small round window of the spacecraft, the moon was no longer a goal. It was a ghost. Silent, untouched, slowly drifting past. The spacecraft was on its way there, but not to land, not to explore, not to plant a flag. They would fly by it, slingshot around its gravity, and use it to turn back toward Earth. The moon was so close, they could see its craters, its scars, its beautiful gray silence. But they couldn't reach it, couldn't touch it. The lunar module, meant to carry them down to the surface, had become a lifeboat, and their mission had changed. Survival now replaced science. Dreams were exchanged for breath. Inside the module, no one said it right away, but they all knew. The moon, which had once filled their minds in training and every conversation, now stood as a painful reminder of what they had lost. It wasn't just a detour, it was goodbye, a quiet, heartbreaking farewell to a dream that had died in an instant. In that explosion that tore through their mission and turned triumph into survival, Jim Lovell had memorized the lunar landing sites. He knew where they would have landed, how they would have explored, what rocks they would have picked up. He had imagined the moment of descent, the moment of stepping off the ladder. And now, as the moon passed silently outside, all he could do was stare and let it go. Fred Hayes didn't speak much in those hours. The fever from his illness burned inside him, but he didn't complain. Maybe because the physical pain was easier than the emotional one. He had worked his entire life for this. Years of training, hundreds of simulations. He had pictured what his family would feel when they watched him walk on the moon. He had wondered what it would feel like to be weightless on that surface. And now, it would remain only a question, a mystery. The moon would never feel his boots, and deep inside, he knew, maybe it never would. Even Jack Swigert, the last-minute replacement, felt the weight of it. Though he hadn't trained for this flight as long as the others, he had still imagined the possibility. He had stood in the simulator, gone through the drills, dreamed the same dream. He had earned his place on that spacecraft. But now, that dream was evaporating with every mile that brought them closer to the moon, and then past it. The flyby was quiet, no celebration, no victory, just silence. And silence in space feels heavier than sound. They were astronauts, trained to be calm, steady, focused, but inside, they were still human. And humans grieve when they lose something they've held on to for years. As the moon drifted past their window, so did all the memories, the expectations, the silent hopes. For Lovell, it would be his last mission. He knew it. He would never go to space again, never get another chance. This was it. He had come so close, so painfully close, and now it was slipping behind them, disappearing into the black sky, like a door quietly closing. Back on Earth, people were watching the news, hoping the crew would return safely. But most didn't realize what else was dying in that moment. They didn't see the invisible heartbreak of three men who had worked their entire lives for something, only to be robbed of it by fate. The moon was supposed to be their moment of glory, their names written in history books next to Armstrong and Aldrin, but instead, they would be remembered for something else, for a disaster they barely survived. NASA didn't talk much about the emotional cost, but the crew felt it deep in their bones. The moon was right there, a few hundred miles away, close enough to see in detail, but impossibly far in every other way. In another timeline, they would have been walking on that surface now, bouncing in low gravity, collecting rocks, laughing in the joy of achievement. Instead, they were floating in a freezing metal shell, rationing water, checking air levels, trying not to die. Jim Lovell once described the moment he saw the moon pass by as one of the loneliest in his life, because it wasn't just a physical distance. It was the moment he knew that his dream, the one he had chased for decades, was gone, and no one would give it back. There would be other moon landings, other names, other footprints, but not his. Still, none of them broke down. None of them gave up. That was the tragedy and the strength of Apollo 13. Even as their dreams burned up in the vacuum of space, they kept moving, kept thinking, kept fighting, because they knew they had families waiting, people hoping, a planet watching. They had each other, and they had a new mission now. Not to touch the moon, but to touch home. That decision to turn back cost them more than people will ever fully understand. It wasn't just the science that was lost, it was the soul of the mission. The moment the explosion happened, their dream died, and no ceremony or medal could bring it back. They had to accept that, and they did, with dignity, with courage, with the kind of strength most people never have to summon. When they finally rounded the far side of the moon and began their return trajectory, There was no radio signal, just silence again. The moon blocked communication with Earth. For a few minutes, they were truly alone, orbiting the dark side of a dream they would never reach. And then, as they came around, Earth reappeared, a blue sphere, distant but beautiful. The moon was behind them now, gone, but in front of them was life. And so, the spacecraft turned its back on the moon. It didn't land. It didn't celebrate. It simply left, because sometimes, survival means choosing what hurts the most. And turning away from the moon, the very reason they went, was the cost of coming home. They would never forget it, never stop feeling the ache of that goodbye. But they also understood something deeper. The mission was no longer about walking on another world. It was about making it back to this one. And that was a dream worth chasing too? The journey back to Earth should have been a time of peace. A time of quiet reflection, maybe even a little joy. The joy of having survived the impossible. But for the Apollo 13 crew, the way home was anything but peaceful. It was cold, it was uncertain, and every moment was filled with the kind of fear that eats away at the human spirit. There were no guarantees anymore, no promises. Just a thin metal spacecraft flying through the silent blackness of space, carrying 3 men who were desperately trying to stay alive. Inside the lunar module, which had not been designed for such a long journey, the temperature dropped to near freezing. It wasn't meant to support life for more than 2 days. Now, it had to last for the walls. Once warm and filled with promise, now felt like the inside of an icebox. Every surface was cold to the touch. Condensation covered the panels and switches, making it slippery and damp. There was no sunlight to warm them, no thick blankets, no heaters. Just their suits, their breath, and the thin hope that Earth was still waiting for them. Water became a luxury. Every sip had to be measured. Each one of them was limited to less than a cup a day, barely enough to keep the body functioning, let alone strong. Dehydration made their mouths dry, their lips cracked, and their minds slower. Eating was harder. The food was cold and unappetizing, and their stomachs weren't interested anymore, but they had to keep going, had to stay alert. Even when their bodies were begging for rest, for heat, for something more than this floating coffin of ice. But water and food were just part of the struggle. The real threat came from something invisible, carbon dioxide. With the main systems shut down, the spacecraft could no longer remove the CO from their breath fast enough. The air they were breathing slowly became poisonous. They started to feel it. Headaches, dizziness, confusion. The fix they had created using duct tape and spare parts worked, but only just. The air was still thin, still stale. Every breath they took was heavy with exhaustion and fear. Yet through it all, they never turned on each other, never snapped, not once. They joked when they could, they spoke calmly when possible. But most of the time, they were quiet, deep in their own thoughts, wondering if this was it, wondering if they'd ever see their families again. Every creak in the ship, every unexplained sound, reminded them that the line between life and death was thinner than paper. One wrong move, one failed system, one tiny spark, and they would become a silent monument drifting forever in space. But even as they rationed food and water, even as they fought off the cold and the dark, they still had one final challenge ahead: re-entry. They had to get back into Earth's atmosphere, and no one knew if the spacecraft would hold together. The heat shield, the one thing standing between them and burning up, had taken damage during the explosion. If it was cracked, even slightly, the entire module would disintegrate in seconds. And no one could check it, no one could fix it. They just had to hope. Hope, that fragile thing. It's easy to have when things are going well. But when your bones ache from the cold, when your stomach is empty, when your hands are trembling, and your breath tastes like metal, hope becomes harder. And yet, they held on to it, with everything they had left, because what else was there? As they approached Earth, the silence in the cabin was louder than ever. They all knew what was coming. They had entered the blackness of space. Now they would have to go through fire. Re-entry meant flames. The spacecraft would hit the upper atmosphere at over 24,000 miles per hour, and the friction would create temperatures over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The spacecraft would become a shooting star, and if anything was wrong, anything at all, they wouldn't make it. On Earth, mission control was quiet. The world was watching. Television screens in every home, every school, every diner played the broadcast. Families clutched each other. Reporters whispered. Engineers stared at their monitors. And somewhere in the crowd, mothers, wives, and children waited, holding their breath, because no one knew if the crew would make it through the fire. Inside the capsule, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert were strapped in, their suits stiff with days of wear. There was nothing left to do but wait. The module separated from the rest of the spacecraft. The dead service module, the part that had exploded, drifted away, revealing the blackened panel where the blast had torn through. It was the first time they had seen the damage with their own eyes, and it was worse than they imagined. But there was no time for fear now, only faith. The spacecraft hit the atmosphere. First came vibration, then heat, then fire. Outside, plasma flared around the hull. The entire capsule shook like it was trying to come apart. They were flying blind. No communication, no contact. For 4 long minutes, they were hidden behind a curtain of flame. On Earth, the silence was unbearable. Normally, blackout lasted 3 minutes. But as second after second ticked by, there was no signal. People began to panic. Had the heat shield failed? Were they lost? Inside, the astronauts gritted their teeth. Their bodies slammed with G-forces. The capsule groaned and twisted. Sweat poured down their faces despite the cold. Everything they had fought for, all the pain, all the sacrifice, now burned outside the window, and they didn't know if they would come out the other side. Then, suddenly, a crackle, a voice. Odyssey, this is Houston. Do you read? Cheers erupted in Mission Control. People cried. People hugged, all across the world. Hearts lifted. The capsule had made it. The parachutes had deployed. And in the sky above the Pacific Ocean, a small dot began to drift down. Not a shooting star, but a miracle falling gently back to Earth. When they hit the water, the impact was hard. But it was the most beautiful pain they'd ever felt. The crew was alive, floating, breathing. The mission that should have been a disaster, that could have ended in death, had turned into one of the greatest rescue stories in human history. Not because of luck, but because of grit, because of heart. Because of the thousands of hands on Earth and the 3 brave souls in space who refused to give up. When the hatch opened and sunlight poured in, it was blinding, and warm, and real. For days, they had lived in freezing shadows. Now, they felt the heat of home. Rescue helicopters flew in. Divers cheered. And somewhere in the crowd of radio voices, they heard the words that made it all worth it. Welcome back. The journey back to Earth had taken them through ice and fire, through silence and fear, but they had made it, not to the moon, not to glory, but to something deeper. They had made it back to life. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all. For 4 days, the world had been watching, waiting, praying. Every heartbeat on Earth seemed to echo the same question. Would they survive? Across continents and oceans, people stopped what they were doing just to listen. Families gathered around televisions, children clutched radios, news anchors held their breath between each sentence. This wasn't just America's mission anymore, it had become a global moment. A fragile thread tied the hearts of millions to a tiny spacecraft drifting through the void, carrying 3 men clinging to life. April 17, 1970. The day began quietly, but carried the weight of the world. The Apollo 13 command module, now separated from the damaged service and lunar modules, was approaching Earth at blistering speed. The re-entry process, dangerous under the best conditions, was now a gamble. If the heat shield was cracked from the explosion, it wouldn't protect them. If the angle was off by even a fraction, they could skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water and vanish into space. And even if everything worked, there was still the blackout. That long, torturous silence when no one could speak to them, and no one knew if they were alive. In Houston, Mission Control was filled with nervous silence. Flight directors and engineers had barely slept in days. Coffee cups sat cold and untouched. Men who had held back tears for hours now sat with their hands pressed over their mouths, staring at the clocks, at the monitors, at each other. They had done all they could. Now it was out of their hands. As the spacecraft hit the atmosphere, communication was lost, just as expected. But those 3 or 4 minutes of silence stretched endlessly. On TV screens, announcers stopped talking. The image showed nothing but a calm ocean and blue sky. Viewers whispered, some cried, some prayed, because blackout should have lasted 3 minutes. But 3 became 4, then 5, and still, nothing. Had something gone wrong? Was the spacecraft gone? Were they lost? It felt like time had frozen. Then, a sound, a burst of static, a voice crackling through. This is Odyssey. Houston, do you read? Cheers exploded inside Mission Control. Men leaped from their chairs. Some shouted, some broke down, their faces in their hands, weeping. Years of training, decades of dreams, and an unthinkable disaster. And they had done it. They had brought them home. A recovery helicopter spotted the capsule descending under its parachutes. Red and white fabric danced in the sky like a flag of victory. The capsule fell toward the Pacific, slowly, gracefully, as if the heavens themselves were laying it gently back down. When the Apollo 13 command module splashed into the ocean at 12:07 p.m. CST, the sound of that impact was heard not just by the divers and ships nearby, but in the hearts of people around the world. It meant safety, it meant life. It meant that against all odds, against mechanical failure, frozen nights, carbon dioxide, and re-entry fire, they had survived. The recovery team moved fast. Helicopters buzzed above, sending down divers who swam through the waves toward the floating spacecraft. They opened the hatch, and out came the astronauts, pale, exhausted, dehydrated, and smiling. Real smiles. Weak, yes, but full of something powerful, the joy of the living. Fred Hayes, Jim Lovell, and Jack Swigert were hoisted aboard the USS Iwo Jima, where sailors erupted in applause. These men had stared death in the face and made it home. Photographs of their arrival were sent across the globe. Newspapers splashed their names in bold. Crowds gathered outside NASA buildings just to cheer. It wasn't about hero worship, it was something deeper. These 3 astronauts had become symbols, not of perfection, but of endurance, of the human will. They had made mistakes, encountered failure, and still found their way back. That felt personal to people. It reminded them that no matter how lost we are, we can still find home again. President Nixon called it a successful failure, a mission that failed to reach the moon but succeeded in proving something far more important. That humanity, when united, could perform miracles. The failure had shown our strength. And in the eyes of the public, Apollo 13 became even more legendary than Apollo 11. Because walking on the moon was extraordinary, but surviving what they did, that was divine. As the astronauts were taken below deck for medical checks, there was a quiet dignity in the way they moved. Not triumphant, not boastful, just deeply, deeply grateful. For each other. For the people on Earth who had fought for their lives day and night, and for life itself. Jim Lovell said later, "We never lost faith. We never gave up." Those words echoed in the hearts of millions. Their families, too, finally exhaled. Marilyn Lovell had kept calm for her children, but now let the tears come. Parents, wives, children, they had suffered their own private nightmare on Earth. Powerless, helpless, but enduring. The splashdown wasn't just the return of astronauts. It was the end of a shared trauma, a moment of healing. Across the world, church bells rang, strangers hugged in the streets, in classrooms, teachers cried in front of their students. For just a moment, in the middle of a Cold War, political tension, and global uncertainty, the world remembered its humanity. The astronauts were brought home to parades and interviews, but none of them craved attention. Their story was already written, not in medals or speeches, but in the silence of space, in the duct-taped air filter, in the freezing shadows of the lunar module, and in that quiet splash on a blue ocean. Apollo 13 reminded us all that space is unforgiving, that technology can break, that plans can fail. But it also taught us something sacred, that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's just three men in the dark, refusing to give up. And when Earth finally saw them again, not as silhouettes on a screen, not as voices through static, but as real, breathing human beings stepping onto the deck of a ship under the sun. It was like seeing light after a long night. They were home, and so were we. When the helicopter blades slowed and the noise of the ocean faded, what remained was silence, a heavy, reflective silence that often follows near-death experiences. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert had returned to Earth as survivors, but not unscathed. Behind their calm smiles and camera-ready appearances, each man carried invisible wounds. Their bodies had endured dehydration, freezing temperatures, and a diet reduced to mere sips of water and bites of food rationed with surgical care. Their muscles had weakened, their sleep had been broken, and their immune systems were taxed. Yet what would take the longest to heal wasn't visible on a scan. It lived in their minds. Fred Hayes, who had suffered from a urinary tract infection during the mission, came back with a fever and severe fatigue. Jack Swigert, the last-minute replacement who had barely had time to train, bore the emotional weight of holding himself to a standard no one ever expected him to meet under such impossible conditions. Jim Lovell, the seasoned veteran and leader, wore a stoic face in public, but privately wrestled with a deep sense of what could have been. They had come so close to touching the moon, they could almost see it from the spacecraft windows, glowing in the distance, quiet and still, unreachable. That loss would stay with them. The world had celebrated their return with banners and parades, but the transition back to normal life was anything but easy. These men had looked death in the eye. They had learned how fragile the line between life and death truly was. The nightmares didn't always come at night. Sometimes it was just the sudden silence of a room that mimicked the deafening quiet of space, or the smell of plastic, which reminded them of the air filters they had taped together in desperation, or the eerie hum of a machine, so much like the failing systems on the ship. Survival left marks. For NASA, the recovery was more than emotional, it was structural. The agency had always prepared for risk, but Apollo 13 exposed how one small flaw could domino into disaster. The explosion that crippled the spacecraft began with a damaged wire and an overlooked design decision years earlier. That error almost killed 3 astronauts, and nearly brought an end to America's space program. Inside NASA, nothing would be taken for granted again. Teams were assigned to investigate every step of the mission, from the manufacturing of the oxygen tanks to the procedures of mission control. Engineers rewrote protocols, managers listened more closely to concerns, simulators were reprogrammed to reflect real-life emergencies that, until Apollo 13, had seemed impossible. The culture of overconfidence was shaken. Humility replaced arrogance. NASA became stronger not in spite of the failure but because of it. The astronauts themselves were seen not just as pilots, but as teachers. Their debriefings were studied line by line. Their decisions in crisis became case studies. They helped NASA design new emergency protocols. They talked openly about fear, about doubt, about the moment they thought they might not make it. In doing so, they gave future astronauts the most valuable training possible. The truth, Jim Lovell never flew to space again. Apollo 13 was his final mission, and though he never set foot on the moon, he became a symbol of leadership under pressure. His calm voice during crisis, his decisions that saved lives, and his humility in the face of uncertainty turned him into a legend. He often said that Apollo 13 was not a failure, it was a triumph of teamwork, grit, and human ingenuity. Fred Hayes would go on to work with the Space Shuttle program, carrying with him the weight of what he had endured. Jack Swigert entered politics and was elected to Congress, but his life was cut short by cancer just before he could take office. His time on Apollo 13 had turned him from an unknown backup into a household name, a reminder that sometimes, fate chooses the right person at the last moment. The American public's response to Apollo 13 was emotional and overwhelming. Unlike previous missions that focused on glory and achievement, this mission connected on a more human level. It wasn't about conquest, it was about survival. People didn't just admire the astronauts, they related to them. They saw their own struggles reflected in those 3 men lost in space. The courage to keep going despite fear, the strength to adapt when everything falls apart, the choice to work together instead of giving up. Those were qualities that resonated far beyond NASA or science. They were universal. Apollo 13 made headlines not because it was perfect, but because it was real, imperfect, vulnerable, and yet unbreakable. It reminded the world that space exploration isn't just about reaching other worlds. It's about discovering who we are, what we can survive, what we can fix, and how we respond when everything we depend on breaks. That kind of story doesn't fade with time, it lingers. In schools, children wrote essays about the mission. "Houston, we've had a problem," became one of the most quoted phrases in history. It wasn't just a line, it was a symbol of honest leadership, of speaking up, of confronting danger with courage. Films, books, and documentaries followed. Decades later, the 1995 movie Apollo 13 would reignite interest in the mission, introducing a new generation to the story of the broken spaceship that somehow made it home. But the most profound impact couldn't be measured in box office numbers or history books. It was in the quiet places, the living rooms where families watched the news together, the hospital rooms where people fighting for life found hope in survival, the classrooms where teachers taught not just science, but resilience. The Apollo 13 mission became part of our shared emotional DNA. It taught us that even when the odds are stacked against us, when we are lost in the coldest darkness, we are never truly alone, not if we refuse to give up, not if we fight together. Today, the command module Odyssey is displayed at the Kansas Cosmosphere, a silver relic of fire and fear and triumph. It stands as a monument to those days when 3 men floated between life and death, and a planet below held its breath. Visitors touch the glass and stare at the scars on the metal. Children press their faces to the display, imagining what it must have been like inside. And for a brief moment, they feel it, the awe, the terror, the hope. The aftermath of Apollo 13 wasn't just about fixing what went wrong, it was about recognizing what went right, about celebrating the human capacity to endure, adapt, and overcome. It was about honoring not only the astronauts, but the thousands of unseen heroes who worked behind the scenes: engineers, technicians, nurses, wives, mothers, friends, who held the line when everything was falling apart. They were broken heroes, but in being broken, they became legends. The legacy of Apollo 13 is not found in the soil of the moon or in the quiet vacuum of space. It is found in the hearts of those who watched it unfold, in the people who cheered, cried, feared, and hoped across the world. It's a legacy carved not from success but from survival, not from perfection but from perseverance. The story of Apollo 13 endures, because it wasn't just about a space mission. It was about the human spirit refusing to surrender when everything seemed lost. After the splashdown, after the celebrations, and after the last camera was turned off, something began to shift deep within NASA. Apollo 13 had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, but more importantly, it had revealed strengths no one knew they had. Space exploration had always been about pushing boundaries, but this mission redefined what that truly meant. From this point forward, every mission was approached with a new kind of respect for space, for machinery, and most importantly, for the fragile lives it carried. The technical lessons from Apollo 13 were immediate and NASA redesigned the oxygen tanks, overhauled safety procedures, and created entirely new protocols for crisis scenarios. Backup systems were improved, communication processes were refined, and cross-training for astronauts became stricter and more intense. Every part of the spacecraft, every switch, wire, and button was re-examined under the harsh light of experience. Nothing was left untouched. The failure had burned itself into the soul of the agency, and in its aftermath grew a culture of vigilance and humility. But the deeper, more profound legacy of Apollo 13 was human. It taught the world that courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, cold, shivering and whispering in the darkness. Don't give up. It showed that real heroes aren't always the ones who reach their destination, but the ones who find their way home when everything goes wrong. It reminded us that failure, when met with determination and teamwork, can become a greater triumph than success ever could. Inside classrooms, Apollo 13 became more than history. It became a lesson in problem solving, in leadership, in emotional resilience. Students didn't just learn the names of the crew. They studied their decisions, their calm under pressure, their willingness to adapt. Teachers used the mission to teach critical thinking and emotional intelligence. What would you do if you had 4 hours of oxygen left and you were hundreds of thousands of miles from home? Became a question not just about space, but about life. The phrase failure is not an option, though not actually spoken during the mission, became the unofficial motto of NASA and a rallying cry for dreamers, builders, and fighters everywhere. It wasn't just about refusing to lose, it was about refusing to accept defeat as the end. It was about trying, adjusting, thinking harder, and believing that where there is breath, there is a way forward. Apollo 13 gave that belief to the world in the most dramatic and unforgettable way. For space exploration as a whole, the mission rebalanced the narrative. Until then, space travel was wrapped in a kind of magic flags on the moon, confident astronauts waving from their seats, technology that seemed unbreakable. Apollo 13 cracked that image open and showed us the raw truth behind the helmet, human vulnerability, and it was beautiful. Because in that truth we saw something far more powerful than a footprint on lunar dust. We saw men freezing, failing, and fighting anyway. That image stayed with the public. It changed how we viewed astronauts not as flawless adventurers, but as deeply human. And in doing so, it made them more relatable, more inspiring. Suddenly, the dream of space wasn't just for the elite few. It became a mirror held up to all of us, showing what's possible when people work together with heart, brain, and soul. The legacy of Apollo 13 also stretched beyond science and engineering. It became part of popular culture, woven into films, documentaries, books, and speeches. The 1995 movie Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks, reintroduced the mission to a new generation and reminded older ones why they had cried that day in 1970. The film wasn't just entertainment, it was reverence, a love letter to those tense hours when humanity proved what it could do when it refused to let go. In boardrooms and battlefields, in classrooms and hospital rooms, the story of Apollo 13 has been told again and again. It has been quoted by leaders during moments of crisis. It has been written into motivational posters, whispered by doctors fighting to save lives, remembered by pilots in dangerous skies. Because at its core, Apollo 13 is a universal story. It's about facing the impossible and, not just surviving, but returning home stronger. As years passed, the spacecraft itself as the Odyssey became a symbol, not for its design, but for its scars. The dents and burns on its body told the truth. This ship had almost died, but it didn't. People who visit it often stare quietly, overwhelmed not by its size, but by the idea that 3 men once lived in that tiny space, surrounded by nothing but darkness and silence, and found their way back. It doesn't matter whether you're an engineer or a poet, that story touches something inside you. NASA's future missions, from the Space Shuttle to the International Space Station and beyond, all carried a part of Apollo 13 with them. The lessons learned during those terrifying days became foundations for safety protocols and mission planning. But even deeper, the MindsetFlexible.com collaborative became a permanent part of NASA's culture. The mission didn't just teach them how to fix a problem, it taught them who they were under pressure, and that might be the greatest legacy of all. Apollo 13 taught us what's possible when the worst happens, when the lights go out, when the system fails, when hope is all you have left. It taught us to look at each other and say, let's try one more thing. It reminded us that sometimes, our greatest strength isn't in reaching the moon, but in refusing to give up on the way there. Even now, more than half a century later, we talk about Apollo 13, not as a failed mission, but as a miraculous one. Because the real mission wasn't to land, it was to live, to fight, to come home. And they did. In the vast stillness of space, where no wind blows and no sound travels, the loudest noise isn't the roar of engines or the crackle of radio signals. It is the heartbeat of humanity, the deep, invisible pulse of courage, connection, and the will to survive. Apollo 13 wasn't just a mission. It was a mirror, showing us who we are when the stars seem far, the light grows dim, and the odds turn against us. In that terrifying silence, we heard the truth about ourselves louder than ever before. What began as a journey to the moon became something far greater. It became a moment in history where science met soul, where the sharp precision of engineering was forced to dance with the soft, unpredictable rhythm of human emotion. Wires, numbers, and metal had to be guided by instinct, teamwork, and heart. In those critical hours, formulas weren't enough. What saved Apollo 13 was not just the math, but the men. Not just the calculations, but the compassion, the calm, the unshakable belief that failure was simply not allowed to write the ending of this story. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes didn't walk on the moon, but they did something far more sacred. They walked into the unknown and came back with a story that would teach generations what survival truly means. Not just physical survival, but emotional resilience, the kind that lets a human being keep moving forward even when the temperature drops. The lights go out, and the air begins to thin. They showed us what it means to be human at the edge of existence. Down on Earth, hundreds of engineers, scientists, and support staff fought a parallel war. Their weapons were slide rules, radios, and coffee-stained papers. But their power came from somewhere deeper, from love, from loyalty, from the understanding that those men out there were not just astronauts. They were fathers, sons, brothers, they were friends. No one in mission control was willing to let them die. And that refusal, that deep emotional commitment, became the fuel that pushed every mind to its limit and beyond. It's easy to think of space as cold, mechanical, and distant, but Apollo 13 showed us that space is also deeply personal. Every inch those men traveled took a piece of every human heart with them. When they suffered, we suffered. When they wept, we wept. And when they made it home, the cheer heard across the globe was not just relief, was awe, because we had witnessed something sacred, the raw, unstoppable power of unity under pressure. The line between science and soul was blurred forever by Apollo 13. Engineers cried. Astronauts prayed. Scientists felt helpless. Families clung to hope. Across the world, people who had never cared about space before suddenly sat glued to their TVs, holding their breath. It wasn't about NASA anymore. It was about us, about every single person who has ever faced something bigger than themselves and wondered if they would make it through. Apollo 13 became a story that belongs to all of us. Because in some way, every person knows what it feels like to be lost in the dark, to feel something explode in their life, to look at the controls and realize they no longer work, to drift in uncertainty, wondering if the next breath will be the last, but then to see a way forward, to think differently, to ask for help, to trust someone else, and slowly, step by step, to come home. That's why Apollo 13 matters more today than ever before. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, this mission reminds us that we are capable of incredible things when we refuse to give up. When we choose teamwork over blame, courage over fear, and hope over despair. It's a reminder that humanity, at its best, is brilliant not because of its technology, but because of its heart. Those men returned to a world that would never see them the same again. They were changed, not just by the cold and the silence, but by the closeness of death and the beauty of survival. They had touched something, eternal something, that no photograph, no report, no documentary could ever fully explain. They had seen, firsthand, the fragile thread that holds life and death apart. And they had returned to tell us what it felt like to hang in that balance. And NASA, it emerged, not defeated, but reborn. Apollo 13 forced the agency to grow not just in technology, but in humility. It reminded everyone that space is not a place to take lightly, that the lives sent beyond Earth are sacred, that every mission carries, not just equipment, but emotion. The Apollo program became more human because of this failure, and in that humanity, it found new strength. Looking back now, we can say that Apollo 13 was never truly about reaching the moon. That may have been the goal, but it wasn't the destiny. Its true purpose was to reveal what lies within us when everything else is stripped away. When we are left with nothing but each other. No mission plan could predict that. No training could prepare for that. And yet there it was. In the silence, in the dark, in the tears shed quietly by a nation waiting, praying, and hoping. In the breath that catches when hope begins to die. And yet, in that darkest hour, something greater would rise. Not from machines, not from computers, but from the hearts of the people who refused to give up. People on Earth, and 3 souls, drifting through space, holding on to life with everything they had. This was not Apollo 11, this was not a victory parade, this was Apollo 13, and it would become one of the most terrifying, emotional, and unforgettable missions in all of human history. In every great story of survival, there are faces behind the struggle, people whose courage and pain shaped the outcome. Apollo 13 wasn't just a spacecraft caught in a crisis. It was a fragile home to 3 human beings. Each man carried his own dreams, fears, and reasons for being there. Each of them had a family waiting at home, and each of them, in that cold and quiet place above Earth, would be tested like never before. Jim Lovell was the commander of Apollo 13. He was no stranger to space. In fact, he was one of NASA's most experienced astronauts. Before Apollo 13, he had already flown in space 3 times. He had orbited the moon on Apollo 8, the first humans to ever travel that far. He had looked out of the window at the vast gray surface, and had seen Earth rise like a blue jewel in the darkness. He had come close to walking on the moon once before. And now, at age 42, this was finally his chance to do it. But Jim was not chasing fame. He had already tasted it. He didn't need medals or headlines. What drove him was something deeper, his love for space, his belief in exploration, and his sense of duty. He was calm under pressure, thoughtful in his decisions, and deeply respected by everyone who worked with him. People trusted Jim. They knew that if anything ever went wrong, he was the man you would want leading the way. He had the heart of a father, the brain of an engineer, and the spirit of a soldier. At home, Jim was a family man. He had a wife, Marilyn, and 4 children. They had watched him leave for space before. They had hugged him goodbye, prayed for his safety, and waited for his voice to echo through the radios. His wife had become strong through those years, learning how to live with the silence, the distance, and the danger. But this time felt different. It was supposed to be his final flight. One last mission before retirement. One last dream to fulfill. Walking on the moon. Beside Jim was Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot. Fred was quieter, less known to the public, but inside NASA, his name carried great weight. He was a skilled test pilot with sharp instincts and a deep understanding of the spacecraft. He had trained for years for this very moment. Apollo 13 was to be his first flight into space and he had earned it. Fred came from humble beginnings. He was not born into privilege. He worked hard for every opportunity, every flight hour, every step that brought him to NASA. He believed in preparation, in discipline, in always being ready for the unexpected. His dream wasn't just to go to the moon, it was to prove to himself and to the world that he belonged there, that he could do it. There was a quiet fire inside Fred. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was the kind of man who studied every manual, every wire, every line of code inside the spacecraft. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He respected the risk. He knew what space could do to a man, and he was ready. Fred had a wife and children too. He had kissed them goodbye, smiled for the cameras, and boarded the rocket like a soldier heading to battle. But deep inside, he carried a boyhood dream, one born under southern skies, watching the stars, imagining the impossible. Then came Jack Swigert, third man aboard Apollo 13. His journey to this mission was different from the others. Jack was not originally part of the main crew. Just days before the launch, the original command module pilot, Ken Mattingly, was pulled from the flight due to medical concerns. NASA feared he might come down with measles during the mission, and with only days to go, a replacement was needed. That replacement was Jack Swigert. Jack was ready. He had trained for this kind of emergency his whole life. He was a pilot, an engineer, and a thinker. But stepping into someone else's role just days before launch was no easy task. He had to absorb complex procedures, build chemistry with the crew, and adjust to a spacecraft that wasn't prepared for him. It was like jumping onto a speeding train and trying to steer it. Many people doubted him, not because he lacked skills, but because time was short, and space does not forgive errors. But Jack was determined. He had worked too long and waited too hard to waste this chance. He stepped up, quietly and confidently, knowing that this might be his only opportunity to fly. Jack had a charm about him. He was handsome, intelligent, and had a certain confidence that made people feel safe. He believed in logic, in systems, in solving problems with his mind, but underneath the confident exterior, he was deeply aware of the weight he now carried. He was joining two seasoned astronauts, and the world would be watching. Despite their different paths, the three men quickly built a bond. In the days leading up to the launch, they trained together, rehearsed emergencies, and shared stories. There was laughter, there was respect, and above all, there was trust. They were three individuals, but inside that spacecraft, they had to become one. One voice, one brain, one heartbeat. Because in space, there is no room for ego. There is only survival. On the day of the launch, they walked together, side by side, wearing their white suits, helmets in hand. Cameras flashed, crowds cheered. Their families watched from a distance, hiding their fear behind brave smiles. The crew looked calm, but each man knew what was at stake. As they entered the spacecraft, sat in their seats, and began the final countdown, they were more than astronauts. They were explorers. They were pioneers. They were willing to risk everything not for glory, but for the pursuit of something greater. When the rocket roared into the sky, their lives changed forever. For a moment, all fear vanished. They were weightless, surrounded by stars, chasing a dream older than time. They were no longer just men. They were symbols of what humanity could achieve. But dreams can turn into nightmares without warning. And soon, these three men would face a test that no training could prepare them for. A silent explosion, a broken ship, a fight for breath, for heat, for life. They would not walk on the moon, but they would walk through something far more powerful. They would walk through fear. They would walk through death's shadow. And they would walk into history not as astronauts who landed, but as men who endured. Their names Lovell Hays and Swigert would become forever linked with one word: survival. The sun rose slowly over Florida's coast on the morning of April 11, 1970. The skies were mostly clear, with a soft breeze brushing across the ocean. There was something sacred about that morning, as if the Earth itself was holding its breath. At Kennedy Space Center, a massive structure stood tall against the sky, the Saturn V rocket, shining white and silver, waiting to be awakened. Hours before launch, the three astronauts were already awake. They had eaten their traditional breakfast of steak and eggs, dressed in their spacesuits, and smiled for the cameras one last time. There were no tears, no trembling voices, just calm, focus, steady hands, and eyes filled with purpose. Inside their hearts, each of them carried something different. Jim Lovell carried the responsibility of leadership. He was not just thinking about the mission, he was thinking about the safety of his crew. Fred Hays carried silent excitement. This was his first spaceflight, and soon he would be traveling farther than most humans had ever gone. Jack Swigert, though new to the team, carried the pressure of proving himself worthy. He had been called in at the last minute, and now, he was about to launch into history. At 11 a.m., final checks began. Engineers ran through endless lists of systems, pressures, and procedures. The countdown echoed across the base, and technicians watched every screen, every signal, every blinking light. The rocket itself, taller than a 36-story building, stood quiet, still, like a sleeping giant ready to rise. Crowds had gathered miles away to watch. Families, students, reporters, and tourists stood behind fences, binoculars in hand. Among them were the wives and children of the astronauts, hiding their fears behind hopeful smiles.